There is a question that has haunted seekers for thousands of years, a question so simple that children ask it, yet so deep that the wisest among us spend lifetimes circling its mystery. The question is this: if the Creator needs nothing, why did the seventh day exist at all? I have walked 83 years on this earth searching for the answer, and what I discovered was not hidden in dusty commentaries or locked behind theological gates. It was living in the fabric of everyday existence, in the bread we earn, in the debts that steal our sleep, in that hollow feeling so many carry, the one that whispers, "You are working harder than ever and still falling behind." But before I share what I found, you should know who is speaking to you. My name is Shimon. I have seen 83 winters. I was born in a town whose name no longer appears on maps, the son of a tailor who arrived in this land carrying nothing but his needles and the sacred words his father had pressed into his memory as a boy. I grew up surrounded by fabric and thread and books whose pages had turned yellow with age, releasing a scent I can only describe as the smell of survival itself, of words that refused to die. For 4 decades, I taught in a small house of study. I was never famous. I wrote no bestsellers. I taught young souls who arrived carrying questions and left, if I did my work well, carrying better questions. That is the mark of true teaching, not answers handed down like stones, but questions refined like silver. I am here today because I feel time growing short, and there is still so much I need to say, not for my own legacy. I care nothing for that, but because the wisdom I've found in these ancient texts belongs to anyone willing to receive it with an open heart. Your faith does not matter. Your background does not matter. Wisdom recognizes no borders. What I will share with you is something the medieval sages called a teaching on the architecture of time, on the sacred pattern of 7, on why that number appears again and again. In the tradition I have devoted my life to understanding. I make you no promises of quick riches. I am not selling anything because I have nothing to sell. What I offer you is different, a lens through which to examine your relationship with work, with rest, with money, and with the people whose lives are woven into yours. What you do with that lens is entirely your choice. Let us begin where everything begins, with the 7th portion. In the opening scroll, the one we call Genesis, the text describes how the world came into being across 6 movements of creative power. And then on the 7th day, something changed. The Hebrew word used is Shabbat. Most people think it means rest in the way we use that word in English, as in the absence of activity. But the root of Shabbat is Shavat, which means to cease, to stop, to bring to completion. The 7th day is not about doing nothing. It is about declaring something whole. The ancient teachers spent generations asking why the text says the Creator rested. One answer stayed with me longer than all the others. They said the Creator did not rest from exhaustion. The rest was itself an act of teaching, a demonstration that pausing has value independent of productivity, that stopping is not the absence of work. It is a different kind of work, the work of seeing what you have built, of acknowledging it, of knowing where you stand. Think about your own week, how the days blur together. I have sat with countless people over the years who described what I came to call the endless week. They worked, they came home depleted, they slept, they returned to work, and at the end of the month, they felt their money had vanished without ever understanding where it went. Not because they were careless, not because they failed to try, but because they never stopped to look, to truly see, to complete the week instead of merely surviving it. The first principle I want to give you comes directly from this tradition of the seventh day. The mystical teachers, especially those who lived in the hills of Safed in the 1500s, developed a practice they called cheshbon hanefesh, the accounting of the soul. Once each week, typically as the work week closed, they would sit down and review not only their material accounts, but their actions, their words, their relationships. It was a moment of radical honesty with themselves. No judgment, no punishment. Just the curiosity of a physician examining symptoms in a patient they wish to understand, not condemn. This practice did not belong only to scholars. It spread to ordinary people in the small villages of Eastern Europe, those communities that exist now only in memory and fading photographs. Carpenters and shopkeepers and seamstresses and bakers would sit each Friday afternoon and review their week, not to torture themselves, to understand. The cheshbon hanefesh contains something that modern psychology has only recently rediscovered. When we name what happened, when we put experience into words, the brain processes it differently. It stops being a flood that carries us helplessly downstream. It becomes information we can use. Research by scholars like James Pennebaker at the University of Texas showed that writing honestly about our experiences has measurable effects on mental well-being and decision-making capacity. The rabbis of the 1600s had no laboratories. They had centuries of observation and a deep faith that honesty with oneself was the beginning of all wisdom. I offer you something concrete, not as a command, as an invitation. Once each week, on whatever day you choose, dedicate 90 minutes to sitting quietly with your financial life, not to panic, to understand. Review what came in, what went out, what obligations you carry, and how you feel about all of it. At the end of that review, write down one question. What in my economic life this week is costing me more than it is giving me? You do not need to answer it immediately. Just hold it. That question, according to the mystical teachers, is a form of prayer, because prayer is not always about asking for things. Sometimes prayer is simply paying attention. Now I want to speak to you about the second principle. And for this, I need to take you to a text that many have heard of, but few have read in its full context. In the fifth scroll, the one called Deuteronomy, in chapter 15, there appears a passage that for centuries was considered one of the most radical legal texts of the ancient world. It describes the year of Shemitah. Shemitah means release, letting go. Every 7 years, according to the biblical tradition, debts were canceled. Loans between community members were forgiven. Agricultural land rested. Nothing planted, nothing harvested. An entire year of profound pause for the economic life of the community. Modern scholars debate whether this was ever fully practiced, but that question interests me less than what the ancient teachers did with this principle across the centuries. What they found was not just an agricultural law. They found a philosophy of how human beings relate to resources. In the Talmudic discussions, the great teacher Hillel, who lived in the 1st century, faced a practical problem. As the 7th year approached, wealthy people refused to lend money to the poor because they feared never recovering it. Hillel, instead of abolishing the practice, created a legal mechanism called the prosbul that allowed loans to be temporarily transferred to the courts so they would not be canceled by the sabbatical year. He did this to protect the most vulnerable because, without credit, the poor were left completely exposed. What fascinates me about this story is not the legal solution. It is what it reveals about how these teachers thought about money. For them, money was not an end. It was a flow, something that moves, that circulates, that serves the relationships between people. The question they asked was not how much money do I have, but what is this money doing in my community? How does it move? Whom does it serve? What connections does it build or destroy? This may seem distant from the reality of someone paying mortgages and utility bills, but I invite you to try an exercise in reflection. Think about the financial commitments you currently carry. Contracts, subscriptions, obligations, economic relationships with other people. Now ask yourself, which of these commitments still makes sense for my current life? Not for the life you had 5 years ago when you signed them, for the life you are living today. The spirit of Shemitah is not an invitation to escape responsibility. It is an invitation to review your responsibilities with honesty, to ask whether you are carrying something by inertia, by fear, or by habit that no longer serves your genuine well-being or the well-being of those who depend on you. In the Jewish tradition, this review has a specific name for the personal realm. It is called cheshbon hashanim, the accounting of the years. It happens not weekly, but every 7 years. Some modern spiritual teachers like Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, one of the great renewers of Judaism in the 20th century, developed contemporary practices based on this cycle. The idea is that every 7 years we naturally enter a different phase of life. And if we do not do the work of releasing what no longer serves us, we end up dragging the weight of decisions made by a version of ourselves that no longer exists. This is not mysticism. This is concrete. Think of people you know who continue paying for things they contracted years ago and no longer use, who maintain partnerships or work relationships that generate more conflict than value, who keep in their lives, in their homes, in their calendars, objects and commitments and habits that belong to an earlier time. The Jewish tradition has a principle for this. It is called bitul, meaning nullification. Not with violence, not with a dramatic rupture, but with the same naturalness that a farmer allows the field to rest so it can bear fruit again. The third principle I want to share took me the longest to understand, and when I finally grasped it, it changed how I see money more profoundly than anything else. In the book of Genesis, in chapter 28, there is a story many people know for its most visual element, the ladder of Jacob. Jacob is fleeing from his brother Esau, sleeping in the wilderness with a stone for a pillow, with nothing. In that moment of absolute precariousness, he has a dream. He sees a ladder stretching from earth to heaven. And when he wakes, before knowing if he will arrive safely at his destination before knowing if his brother will forgive him before having anything at all. He makes a promise. He says, if the divine accompanies me on this path, I will give 1/10 of everything I receive. The mystical teachers spent centuries meditating on this moment. Why did he promise to give before having? Why not wait until he arrived, until he stabilized, until he had enough? The answer they found has to do with the nature of abundance. According to the tradition of the Zohar, the central text of medieval Kabbalah, abundance is not a static state. It is movement. It flows, and for it to flow toward us, it must also be able to flow from us. A hand that only receives and never gives ends up closed, and a closed hand cannot receive anything new. This is not merely spiritual metaphor. The economist and philosopher Amartya Sen, who received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998, developed what he called the capabilities approach. One of his central observations was that communities practicing forms of reciprocity and redistribution tend to develop greater economic resilience than communities where resources concentrate and accumulate without movement. The Hebrew practice of ma'aser, meaning tithe or 1/10, has a complexity most people do not know. It was not a single tithe, but several different types depending on the recipient and purpose. The ma'aser ani, the 10th for the poor, was the one that most interested the Talmudic teachers in times of crisis, not as optional charity, but as social architecture, a way of ensuring that no one would be left completely without resources in a community. Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who lived in the 18th century and wrote the most widely read book of spiritual ethics in the Jewish tradition. The Path of the Just wrote something I have thought about for decades. He said that the miser is not necessarily the one who has much and gives little. The miser is the one who lives from the fear that there will not be enough, because that fear, that internal contraction, closes their perception of the possibilities existing around them. They live in a world of scarcity, not because the world is scarce, but because their fear makes them perceive scarcity everywhere. And here is where spiritual tradition and contemporary psychology meet in a way I find extraordinary. Research on scarcity mindset conducted by Sendil Malainathan and Eldar Shafir, published in their book Scarcity in 2013, demonstrated that constant preoccupation with lack of resources, whether money or time or anything else, literally reduces the cognitive capacity available for making decisions, not as metaphor, as measurable fact. The stress of scarcity occupies mental bandwidth we could otherwise use to solve problems creatively. The practice of generosity, independent of its spiritual meaning, functions as an antidote to this contraction. When you give, even if only a little, you act from a different premise. The premise that there is enough, that you do not need to hoard from fear, that the cycle can continue. And that premise, when it becomes habit, gradually changes how you perceive your own possibilities. I am not asking you to take vows of poverty. I am not asking you to give more than you have. The Jewish tradition is very clear that one who gives until becoming destitute has acted imprudently. There is a limit, 20% maximum, according to most Talmudic sources, precisely to protect the dignity of the giver. What I propose is far more modest The next time you receive income, before paying anything else, set aside a small portion, whatever you can, 5 or 7 or 10%, and donate it to something or someone you believe needs it more. Not as a magical act, as a practice of perspective, as a way of reminding yourself that you are someone who can give, not only someone who must survive. These 3 principles, the deliberate rest and weekly review, the honest audit of commitments that no longer serve, and the practice of generosity as antidote to fear, are not 3 financial tricks. They are 3 facets of a single life philosophy, a philosophy that did not originate in the world of finance, but in the world of spirituality, and yet has profoundly practical consequences for how we live our relationship with resources. I want to be honest with you about something important. This teaching comes with no guarantees. The rabbinic tradition has much to say about the mystery of suffering, about why good people face difficulties while others acting with less integrity seem to prosper. The Talmud does not avoid these questions. It debates them for centuries without reaching a definitive answer, because some questions are too large for answers, and what matters is never stopping asking them. What I can tell you, based on 40 years of teaching and 83 years of living, is this: people who cultivate the habit of weekly pause, who review their lives honestly, with regularity, and who practice some form of generosity, tend to live with greater inner peace regarding matters of money. Not necessarily with more money, but with less anguish, with greater clarity about what truly matters, and with a sense that they are active agents of their own lives rather than victims of circumstances beyond their control. And that, in my experience, is worth more than any amount of money. I want to end with something that is not part of any ancient text. It is something I learned by observing people across the years. The great teachers of the Talmud had an expression, Kol Yisrael, Arevim, Ze Laze, meaning all of Israel is responsible one for another. The word Arevim is fascinating. It shares the same root as the word for guarantee, aval, but it also shares the same root as the word describing the sweet interweaving of 2 distinct flavors. Medieval commentators noted this. We are mutually responsible, not as burdens to each other, but as ingredients that complement, that together create something neither could create alone. This is not only a teaching for the Jewish community, it is a way of understanding the human condition. None of us arrived here alone. None of us survives alone. And genuine prosperity, the kind that lasts, the kind that can be transmitted, is not built in isolation. It is built in the network of relationships of trust, generosity, and mutual responsibility that we weave across the years. If there is someone in your life, right now a neighbor, a family member, a colleague who is in a difficult situation, consider whether there is something concrete you can do, not from the superiority of one who gives to one who lacks, but from the recognition that today you are the one who can help, and tomorrow it might be reversed. That is the network. That is the fabric that communities surviving for millennia learn to build and to tend. If this teaching resonated with you, if you found something in these words that made you reflect on your own life, I am glad. Not because that gives me any personal merit, but because I genuinely believe the world becomes slightly better when people reflect honestly on how they live. If you want to continue exploring these traditions, I invite you to do so with a spirit of free inquiry. There are wonderful texts accessible in many languages. The Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, is perhaps the most accessible of the Talmudic texts and contains centuries of practical wisdom on living with integrity. The Path of the Just by Luzzatto, that I mentioned earlier. And if you are interested in Kabbalah, the work of Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of the 20th century, offers an academic and rigorous entry into that tradition. If you know someone who right now is searching for a different way of thinking about their life and their resources, and you believe these teachings might be useful to them, share this with that person, not as an act of proselytizing, but as what any friend would do who found something interesting and thinks another might be interested too. And if you want to leave a reflection in the comments, something these ideas made you think about your own life, I would be glad to read it. Not as ritual, not as magical declaration, but as what it is. The beginning of a conversation these texts have been inviting us to have for 3,000 years. I am 83 years old, and I have learned that time is the only truly non-renewable resource. Money comes and goes. Circumstances change. People enter and exit our lives. But moments of clarity, moments when we truly understand something about ourselves and about how we want to live, those are treasures no one can take from us and that we can give without losing them. May those who seek find what they are looking for. May those carrying too heavy a burden be able to release it with dignity. May those working with honesty enjoy the fruit of their effort. And may in every home there be a moment of sufficient silence to hear what truly matters. Blessed be the name. Peace.